I'm delighted to act as moderator for today's webinar, which focuses on some of the important findings that came out of a public opinion survey on the threat posed in Canada by radicalization and homegrown terrorism. The Canadian Race Relations Foundation is very pleased to be joined today by Ian Holliday. Ian is a research associate with the Angus Reid Institute. He will guide us through the research findings and answer your questions on this important topic. But as always, a few words before we begin. The first portion of our webinar will be given to Ian's presentation. You'll have the opportunity to type your questions as they occur to you, but we will hold all questions until the end. While the presentation is going on, we will attempt to group the questions together to make sure we answer as many as possible. So don't feel ignored if you don't hear your precise question asked. It's just us doing some mashups in the background. So let us begin. To what extent do Canadians perceive there to be a threat of homegrown terrorism in their country today? And is that threat more likely to come from radicalized Muslims or white supremacists? The Angus Reid Institute and the Canadian Race Relations Foundation partnered on a nationwide survey of 1,509 Canadians that answered these and other questions about the dangers of radicalization in Canadian communities. The topic is an important one, not only because it speaks to issues of safety and security in the public square, but also because it speaks to the way in which we view our fellow Canadians and to the strength of our multicultural Canadian identity. Ian, please take us through the report.
Thank you, Len. And thank you all for joining me. Good afternoon or good morning to those of you who, like me, are on the West Coast. I wanted to start because I know that a lot of what the CRRF has done in recent years has focused on the issue of reconciliation between Indigenous and settler Canadians. I wanted to start just by acknowledging that I am coming to you from unceded Coast Salish territory here in Vancouver, British Columbia, specifically the ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. While that's not directly related to the topics that I'm going to be talking about today, I think it's important to acknowledge as we begin this, this presentation. So, as Len mentioned, my name is Ian Holliday. I'm a research associate with the Angus Reid Institute. My background is not in market research or in, public opinion per se. My background originally is in journalism. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in journalism, and have worked as a journalist in both in the United States, where I'm from, and here in Vancouver. And so I don't necessarily have the same sort of research-heavy background that you might expect from someone who conducts polling for a living, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of overlap between what my training is in and working as a pollster. Being a journalist on some level is about asking questions, and being a pollster is basically asking those questions, but in a more formalized way of a lot more people at the same time. So I want to start, I guess, by talking about the Angus Reid Institute, which was founded in October 2014 by Dr. Angus Reid, who is one of Canada's oldest and most respected names in polling. Angus's goal in creating the Institute was to remove the profit motive from his polling work. So after a lifetime of doing market research, he was really interested in having the freedom to do strictly public-facing, policy-related work that could be made publicly available and presented in a transparent way online at angusreid.org, and that would really help sort of inform the public discourse here in Canada. And certainly all of our work that we do is self-commissioned and self-funded, except for the small number of partnership projects that we do with nonprofit organizations and other organizations like the CRRF that have missions that dovetail with ours in terms of public information, public interest research on topics of interest like this one. So about this poll, the data that I'm presenting today is part of the poll conducted in partnership with CRRF in late March of this year. And it aimed to track Canadians' views on radicalization and homegrown terrorism against what they were in 2014 when we first asked some of these questions. The survey also aimed to do a better job of streaming people into the different types of radicalization and the different types of homegrown terrorism. Specifically, as Len mentioned, radical Islamic terrorism on one hand, and terrorism that stems from white supremacist or white nationalist beliefs. The sample was conducted on an online panel called the Angus Reid Forum, which, despite the name, is not affiliated directly with the Angus Reid Institute. And a probability sample of this size would carry a margin of error of plus or minus 2.5 percentage points, 19 times out of 20. So on the topic of homegrown terrorism, let's start by asking, what does a terrorist look like? And if you don't recognize these two men, the one on the left is Michael Zehaf-Bibeau, the 2014 Parliament Hill shooter, and the one on the right is Alexandre Bissonnette, the 2017 Quebec City mosque shooter. Both of these men, in some contexts, in many contexts, might be considered white. Zehaf-Bibeau has an added sort of racialized layer to his identity because he was a Muslim. He converted to Islam, actually, later in life, and that was part of the radicalization narrative that got told about him in the media. Each of these men committed a distinct attack for distinct reasons, and I don't want to be seen to be equating them. But at the same time, I think there are some useful similarities to pull out of their narratives. You know, the details that emerged about each of them after the acts of terrorism that they committed have a number of similarities. Both of them were Canadian citizens. They both became increasingly zealous in their beliefs over time. And they both committed terrorist attacks as an expression of those extremist views. They also both behaved erratically and seemed mentally unstable to some of the individuals in their lives before, and in Bissonnette's case, afterwards, you know, after their attacks. These two men are Canada's homegrown terrorists. And they're an interesting juxtaposition because while both of their stories were framed as terrorism by politicians and by the media, we have a tendency in North America to think of terrorism as something that is specifically or explicitly the province of Muslims or Arabs or people from the Middle East or North Africa. That is a somewhat limited definition or understanding of terrorism, and one of the key goals of this research was to try to gauge the degree to which Canadians are sort of alive to the idea that a mass shooting committed for political reasons by a white shooter could also be considered terrorism, and very often isn't. So, when we asked in 2014, it was shortly after the Parliament Hill shooting, and we asked this question about the degree to which homegrown terrorism is a threat. We like framing questions for our respondents as opposing statements, opposing ideas, and asking them to pick the side of this debate that, or of a given debate, that most closely aligns with the way that they feel, even if it's not exactly how they feel. And so when presented with this juxtaposition, in October 2014, 62% said that there was a serious threat of homegrown terrorism. This time around, when in March, the most recent act of homegrown terrorism was the Quebec City mosque shooting, which was more than a year before that, we see that the number of people who say that it's a serious threat has decreased considerably, and the number of people who say that politicians and the media have overblown the threat of homegrown terrorism in Canada has risen accordingly. That is something that I think is to be expected given the relative distance from the two terrorist attacks that each of these polls took place in or after. But what kind of threat? So in the 2014 research, we didn't really make a distinction between different potential motivations for homegrown terrorism or potential styles of radicalization, different streams of extremist views that people might hold. We presented this concept to people and presented the face-off on the previous slide, and moved on to some of the other questions in the survey. This time around, we made an effort to ask the degree to which people consider each of these two potential motivations for homegrown terrorism a threat or a serious threat to Canada today. And as you can see, the perceived threat of homegrown terrorism that is coming from a radical Islamic or Muslim place versus coming from a white supremacist place is it's considerably higher for the perceived threat of radical Islamic terrorism. These findings, of course, speak to the dichotomy that I mentioned earlier and that I'm far from the first person to point out, which is that although white supremacist terrorism has been on the rise in recent years, particularly in the United States, but of course in Canada as well, we don't tend to see acts of violence committed by white people out of fear or hatred of non-white people as terrorism. We don't tend to think of white nationalists as having been radicalized. We tend to think of this as more explicitly the domain of young Muslim men, and that I think is reflected in the public opinion on this question. But in fairness to Canadians, they do seem to be alive to the idea that white supremacist attitudes in our society should be cause for concern. We asked this question that you can see summarized in the graph about a variety of different prejudices that people in Canadian society today might have, and whether each one is cause for a concern or not. Certainly at the top of the list, and quite strikingly so, with a full majority saying that it's a great deal of concern, is the idea that there are radical Islamic attitudes in Canadian society. But second on the list is that problem of white supremacy. We see more than twice as many people saying that white supremacist attitudes are cause for no concern at all compared to radical Islamic attitudes. But at the same time, we see a recognition from a majority of Canadians that this is a cause for at least some concern. And the second highest number of Canadians in the whole survey saying that, in fact, this is a cause for a great deal of concern. So there is some recognition that these two things are threats. And I should say that this is not in any way a zero-sum game. Both terrorism motivated by Islamic attitudes and terrorism motivated by white supremacy can be threats to Canada at the same time. And this isn't a competition between the two of them to see who can, scare Canadians more. It's more a comparison to say who are Canadians more afraid of. And what we find, as is often the case, is that the population that they are more concerned about, rightly or wrongly, is the non-white population. Oops. So we asked what people think causes someone to become radicalized or turn into a homegrown terrorist. And part of the dynamic of public opinion here is what Canadians perceive as the sources of these two things. So they are viewed, by and large, both in 2014 and in 2018, as a product of religion or of culture, which is something that white supremacists are not generally thought of as having. Certainly, everyone has a culture and a religion, even if that is atheism or some active rejection of religion. Everyone has these descriptors that could be applied to them, but typically we don't think of these descriptors as being sort of key motivating factors for white supremacist terrorism in the way that we think of them as sort of front and center when it comes to terrorism inspired by the likes of ISIS or Boko Haram or other organizations like that. Beyond that top-level finding of religion and culture, you can see that there are some other interesting ones here, particularly feelings of marginalization, which I think the van attack in Toronto earlier this year, which happened after this survey was conducted, is an example of how feelings of marginalization as a motivation for, taking an extremist point of view and then acting on that extremist point of view in a violent way, is something that, while it certainly is, pertains very directly to people who are on the margins of society, it's not exclusive to those individuals. People across society are subject to feelings of marginalization, and certainly if you look in at the story that has emerged about the alleged perpetrator of the van attack in Toronto, that is a case of an individual who, according to all of the reporting that's been done, rightly or wrongly, felt very much as though he had been marginalized, and that was something that he, internalized and eventually acted on in a violent and terrible way. So the slight increase in recognition of that, coupled with the slight decrease in recognition of mental illness as a cause for radicalization or homegrown terrorism, I think is a potentially encouraging note in this survey, and certainly something that if we were to continue doing this survey over the long term and revisited this in 2021 or 2022, we would be interested to see whether those numbers have continued to shift in that direction. So there are some interesting demographic findings in this study, particularly when it comes to this dichotomy between homegrown radical Islamic terrorism and homegrown white supremacist terrorism. The first thing I think to point out is that age is clearly a factor. Younger people 18 to 34, tend to be less concerned, particularly about radical Islamic terrorism, than older individuals. Beyond that, gender is also a key component of this, and gender, I think, is a key component of discourse about terrorism and radicalization more broadly, because, of course, the vast majority of the people who perpetrate these acts are men, particularly young men. And young men, there is something notable about that fact that young men are perhaps in some way especially vulnerable to the forces that lead to radicalization. What we see is that women of all ages are at least 10 points more likely than men in their age group to say that there is a serious, either a quite serious or a very serious threat of homegrown white supremacist or white nationalist terrorism in Canada today. I think that that's an interesting finding to note, and perhaps speaks to the fact that so many of the individuals who commit acts of mass violence have prior histories of domestic violence, and certainly a recognition on the part of women, perhaps, that the type of person who is likely to become radicalized is also a type of person that they have perhaps encountered in their lives before. And certainly not every individual that you've had a bad relationship with or a bad interaction with is a terrorist waiting to happen, but I think there is a sense on the part of many women that this is often a familiar narrative that comes out after a terrorist attack. Excuse me, I'm going to take a drink of water. So political partisanship tells an even bigger story, with, as you can see from the second graph on this page, those who voted for the Liberals and the NDP in 2015, they're about equally likely to view homegrown radical Islamic terrorism and homegrown white supremacist or white nationalist terrorism as serious threats to Canada today. Those who voted for the Conservative Party, however, are much less sort of equal in assigning their concern. As you can see, 7 in 10 past Conservatives say that there is a serious threat of radical Islamic terrorism to Canada today, compared to fewer than 3 in 10 who say that there's a serious threat of white supremacist or white nationalist terrorism. That speaks to a finding that is somewhat consistent in this data with conservatives expressing a different set of perspectives, a generally different view than other people who voted for other parties on these issues. Specifically, I think it's very interesting to note this question, another face-off question that we did about the Muslim community here in Canada and whether they are a partner in the fight against radicalization or a part of the problem of radicalization? When we asked this question in 2014, past conservative voters were split. And when we asked it this time around in 2018, we see that many of them seem to have gotten off of the fence in the direction of viewing Muslims with distrust and viewing them as a part of the problem. There are two, in my mind, possible explanations for this, because the timing of these surveys is such that the groups being referenced under the CPC label there are two different groups of individuals. In 2014, we were looking at people who had voted for the conservatives in the 2011 federal election, when Stephen Harper and his party got about 40% of the national popular vote. In 2018, of course, we're looking at the 2015 results and seeing a group of conservative voters that were about 30% of the population, or 30% of the electorate, rather than 40. And so either the graph here is exactly what it says on the label, and conservative-minded individuals in Canada have been coarsening in their views towards the Muslim community in this country, which of course would be cause for concern, I think, for Andrew Scheer and the leadership of the Conservative Party. Or this is a case of the 2011 conservative base, including a considerably larger and more moderate faction of the election, and in 2015, many of those individuals would have defected to other parties or not voted, and what we're left with is a rump conservative party. I mean, rump is maybe too strong of a word for 30% of the electorate, but regardless, we're left with a more hardcore base that has always felt this way about Muslims in Canada. Either way, that's certainly something that politicians in this country, and right-leaning ones especially, should be cognizant of and thinking about how they want to address. For the record, the top line on this question is completely unchanged from 2014 to 2018. In 2014, it was 58% saying that the Muslim community is a partner in the fight against radicalization, compared to 42% saying it's part of the problem, and those numbers are the same in 2018. So the vast majority of us, not the vast majority, but about 6 in 10 of us, view the Muslim community in Canada, Canadian Muslims, as a partner in combating radicalization and heading off acts of homegrown terrorism before they start. But of course, when we ask this follow-up question about whether leaders in that community are speaking out enough against homegrown terrorism, we find that a majority of Canadians, both in 2014 and in 2018, say that they are not doing so. This question is quite unfair. There's no equivalent question that could be asked of the white leaders, or the leaders of the white community in Canada, because the Muslim community in Canada is a minority population, and because they are viewed as a result of that as a monolith, we end up with a situation where Canadians can feel as though they haven't seen Muslims on their TV standing up and condemning actions. Now, many Muslim leaders in Canada do in fact do that every time there is a terrorist attack in Canada or abroad. But it's a sort of impossible setup for them, where anyone who doesn't happen to see that given interview or that that particular instance is going to then be presented with a question like this and feel as though, well, you know, I haven't actually seen that much of these folks, and they should be doing more. You wouldn't set up this same question for the white majority in Canada and say leaders of the white community, because the white community, being the majority, is viewed in a much more nuanced way. So all of that to say, this is an unfair question. Why have we asked it? And the answer is that very often in public opinion, the information, the data that you get from a population is uninformed or misinformed or feels uncertain. And that is important information in a democracy to be able to collect and to be able to act on. So in a situation like this, it's certainly encouraging for us to see that the percentage of people who say that leaders of the Muslim community here in Canada are speaking out enough against homegrown terrorism has grown over the last 3.5 years. And we would hope that through the continued efforts of people both in the Muslim community and especially people in Canada, Canadians who consider themselves allies to Canadian Muslims, continue to do the work to try to change this public perception that comes through loud and clear in this survey, and try to continue moving this this result in the opposite direction, in the direction of the note that leaders are doing enough, and that they are part of the solution, not part of the problem. So that is, there are lots more findings in this survey, and I encourage you to, if you are interested in reading about them, to visit angusreid.org. The full link is there on the screen now, and read the full report. These were just some of the highlights, particularly along the axis of the difference between concern over Islamic terrorism and concern over white supremacist motivated terrorism in Canada today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Ian. Okay, so we'll start. We have a few questions that have come in, and we encourage other members of the audience to take a moment to provide your questions as well. So, first question for you, Ian. The information gathered in the survey is useful at the macro level, but I wonder if the data has yielded any significant regional differences in terms of the perceived threat of Islamic extremism and white supremacist group terrorism. Yeah, so obviously if you go to the website, you can see sprinkled throughout the report on this this data is some provincial or regional level information, and there are some interesting trends, starting first and foremost with Quebec, where in 2014 the face-off, the first face-off that I talked about, is it a serious threat or has it been overblown by politicians and the media? Quebec in 2014 was very much on the side of it's a serious threat, and this time around they have come down considerably in that. They're now down to a 50-50 split from, I think, close to 7 and 10 saying that it was a serious threat. And so that's an interesting but perhaps explicable finding, explicable in that before the Parliament Hill shooting, just a couple days before actually, there was also
an attack by a Canadian man who professed to be inspired by ISIS, who ran over a Canadian soldier, and that was also treated as a terrorist attack, and that took place in the province of Quebec. So certainly that would have been why it was top of mind for Quebecers at the time of the first survey, and that doesn't necessarily explain why it would have decreased so much, so dramatically, down to a 50%. By 2008, the mosque shooting in Quebec City was also a Quebec-based terrorist attack. But regardless, that was one of the most sort of notable findings. Another interesting one, particularly as it pertains to the perceived threat of radical Islamic terrorism versus white supremacist terrorism, is that in every province or region across the country, because we roll up Atlantic into a single region for the purposes of being able to have a large enough subbase to analyze data there. But in every region across the country, except for British Columbia, we find that the number of people saying that there is a quite serious or very serious threat of radical Islamic terrorism outpaces the percentage of people saying this of white supremacist terrorism. In BC, it's reversed. It's about 56% saying that there's a serious threat of white supremacist terrorism, compared to less than 50% who say that of radical Islamic terrorism. There are a number of different factors for why that might be, different potential explanations. One that is tempting, but maybe not, maybe doesn't stand up to that much scrutiny, is the idea that British Columbia is one of Canada's more diverse provinces, certainly BC, Ontario, and Quebec being the largest population centers in the country, tend to also be where a lot of immigrants end up landing, and certainly past research, not by the Angus Reid Institute, but by outside organizations, tends to suggest that exposure to diversity also makes you more welcoming of and tolerant of diversity, and I would suspect also less tolerant of people who hold white supremacist attitudes. Now, of course, we don't see a similar spike in Ontario or in Quebec in terms of concern over white supremacy outpacing concern over radical Islam, and so there's probably other factors at work in British Columbia as well, and I'm not entirely sure what those are.
Thank you very much. We're just going to go to the next question. As part of this survey, have you been able to examine the impact of political discourse and media rhetoric on how opinions towards various Muslim and Arab communities is shaped?
That's an interesting question, and one that I think we don't have any questions in this survey that directly get at that. So we didn't ask Canadians, what media coverage have you seen of this issue, and was it favorable or unfavorable to a particular group? That said, I think there are some sort of macro level takeaways that you can get from generally the way that media in our society tends to cover terrorism. I won't say that I am active on Twitter. I read Twitter a lot more than I actually tweet, but regardless, whenever there is a breaking news situation involving a shooter, there is this sort of moment that happens where the Twitterverse, as it were, has this period of uncertainty where it's, okay, is the shooter white? Because if the shooter is white, then we have a whole set of discourses that we're going to go through, and it's going to be, particularly if it's something that's happening in the United States, it's going to be a conversation about gun legislation and gun control rather than a conversation about terrorism. If the shooter is Muslim, then we're going to be having a whole different conversation, and it's media that drives that. It's the way that media, and I guess to a lesser extent politicians as well, choose to frame events of mass violence I don't want to betray my craft here, because I certainly, as a journalist, understand why there is a tendency, why it is a story that a Muslim shooter has radicalized views and that this is an act of terrorism. I understand why that's a story and why it fits into the existing narrative that we have. But I think we don't do a good job in media in North America of connecting similar dots when it is an act of terrorism that's being committed by a member of the ethnic majority.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I suppose by way of, by way of example, when we reflect back on the, on the act of terrorism on Yonge Street, the media, or certain elements of the media, seem to seek out opportunities of identifying in advance Mr. Manassian as being a member of the Muslim community. Indeed, in one case, one reporter took the opinion of a witness who said that the driver of the van looked to be wide-eyed and Middle Eastern. And as folks may reflect, what exactly does Middle Eastern look like, especially in a van speeding by? Another question that has come in, thinking about the best way to address radicalization, and it appears that the reader probably read the report that you folks produced as supplementing your presentation today. Respondents seemed quite clear that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But did they offer any thoughts about what programs might be effective beyond expressing a clear preference for something to be done in the schools?
Yeah, so we asked a question in 2014 that we repeated in this this edition of the survey about what is the best place to prevent homegrown terrorism, and what we find is that there is, in 2014, it was pretty evenly split between schools and places of worship. So theoretically mosques. About 27% in 2014 said schools, and 25% said places of worship. This time around, I think possibly as a result of the added focus on white supremacy as a source of terrorism, we see that the number of people saying that the best place to address the radicalization of Canadians is in schools has shot up to 39%, and the number of people saying that places of worship is the best place to be combating this has dropped considerably to just 13%. That seems like a product of people taking this survey and seeing the added layer of focus on other types of extremist points of view and prejudices that exist in society, and thinking of this issue, perhaps thinking of this issue more complexly. And so rather than placing the focus on this, this notion of places of worship as the source of this problem, so to speak. They are taking a more holistic view and not thinking of the problem as just pertaining to Muslims. Beyond schools or places of worship, we also see a significant number of people in 2018, about 1 in 5, saying that the best place to address the radicalization of Canadians is in family homes, which of course speaks to the idea that so many of the people who commit these acts, regardless of what the ideology is that they've latched onto that is motivating them to do it, are coming from a place of personal trouble in their lives, a sense that they are, that feelings of marginalization finding again, a sense that they are in some way inadequate in their lives. And certainly, this is perhaps the most difficult place to try to reach someone, because unless you know them personally and are involved in their lives, you're not going to be able to get into their home to address it. But at the same time, there is something that feels very encouraging about that prospect. It feels like that's a place where you really could reach someone if you were, directly involved in their lives and able to have a conversation with them, an ongoing conversation with them over multiple days. You might be able to steer them away from the path that their radicalization, their radical beliefs are leading them down.
Okay, we're just flipping back to the question screen, and yeah. So among the more troubling findings of the survey are the dominance of religion/culture and mental illness-based understandings of radicalization. This despite academic research having challenged both these explanations. Does your survey provide any possible policy recommendations to improve public understanding of this issue?
So I think part of the it's always easier in public opinion research to get at what people are thinking the problems are than it is to get at what they think the solutions should be. Certainly, our survey is designed in such a way that it is much more focused on assessing how people perceive these different motivations for homegrown terrorism, rather than how they think we could change the perception or change the narrative around it. Certainly, in and of itself, measuring the degree to which people are sort of misunderstanding this issue is hopefully helpful to policymakers in terms of giving them a baseline for what the public knowledge is, so that they can craft some policies to try to improve that knowledge and counteract any sort of misinformation or misunderstandings that Canadians may have. In terms of findings in this survey that speak toward a more like future-looking perspective, we did ask, and I think this is what the previous question asker was referencing about an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We asked in a very broad sort of way, as is often the necessity in a survey like this. We asked, where should the federal government be putting more priority when it comes to addressing radicalization of Canadians with violent ideologies? and the options were sterner measures to punish radicalization or more initiatives to prevent radicalization. And a full majority, 56% in 2018, say that the government should be more focused on initiatives to prevent radicalization rather than punishing those who have already gone down that path. So certainly, from a very sort of high-level perspective, there is an appetite for Canadians, even if they are misunderstanding the sources of radicalization. There does seem to be a degree of empathy on the part of the Canadian public toward people who are becoming radicalized, and a sense that the more fruitful path to go down would be to try to reach out to these people and prevent them from getting to the point where they might want to commit an act of terrorism, rather than trying to focus on harsh punishment as a deterrent.
Thank you for that. A thought that occurred to me as you were providing your explanation is, and looking at the graph that prompted the question from one of our audience members, is that one category of explanation that might be missing from that graph is one that explicitly points to ideology. I think, and again, perhaps I'm reading too much into the graph, but within today's context, when we see religion culture being offered as an explanation, that choice would seem to lead almost ineluctably to the Muslim community or to Islam as a motivating factor. But when we look at the white supremacist movement, and whether we're looking at involuntary celibates, or any of the groups that fall under the alt-right, Sons of Odin, La Moute in Quebec, these groups are to a very large extent motivated by a unifying underlying ideology. And one wonders how the results might have changed if ideology would have been a choice as well.
Absolutely, and I think that's a consideration that we would want to incorporate into this question in the future. There's always a balancing act in polling when doing a tracking study like this, especially if it's becoming a longitudinal study, which this may or may not be. There isn't currently any plan that I'm aware of to replicate this in the future, but at the same time, it is certainly something that is a topic that's not going to go away, and about which it would be interesting to continue tracking people's views. It's always a balancing act to, when you're doing a longitudinal polling study, how beholden are you to maintaining the original language of the questionnaire for the purposes of tracking versus do you want to, improve past questions, because questions can always be improved, even if that means that the sort of trend line over time will not be as accurate, because you've introduced new, in this case it would be introducing a new option that would then sort of potentially take away responses from some of the other categories, and that maybe is okay, and it's a question that we would have to have in designing another wave of this survey. There are lots of questions that I would like to ask about this topic that I have thought of since preparing for this presentation and doing some media interviews over the last 24 hours or so since we released the report. There are lots of questions that I would like to add to a future version of this survey. And so I do hope that we get a chance to do that, and that I'm still around to be involved in it.
So following up on that, one of the questions, and in the interest of transparency, Ian, you and I talked about this before, But were respondents given a definition of what terrorism means? And for that matter, were they given a definition of what radicalism means? Again, and it gets into the question of, should the attack by Alec Minassian be seen as terrorism? Should the actions of Canadians who join groups like the Meute, which is the wolf pack in Quebec, or other anti-immigration groups, should they be seen as being normal political discourse, or are they progressively becoming radicalized?
Right. So the focus of this survey has been specifically on the notion of homegrown terrorism. So a definition for homegrown terrorism was given to respondents, but of course that definition relied on a sort of baseline assumption of what terrorism means, right? Because the definition of homegrown terrorism that was given to people was like, that is terrorism that is planned by Canadian citizens and perpetrated against fellow Canadians. So you have to, there is a layer there at which terrorism is still ill-defined. But of course, terrorism has always been ill-defined. It's one, the line from the Reagan administration was, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And of course, terrorism is sort of inherently a pejorative word. It's something that you label people whose actions you don't condone. Whereas if the same action were committed, perhaps in the name of a cause that you yourself support, you would probably, even if you condemned that action, you might not say that it was an act of terrorism or that the people who committed it were terrorists. You would say, well, what they've done is unfortunate and unacceptable, but it's also in furtherance of this higher cause. I don't know whether that's actually the best way of framing it now that I've finished saying it, but regardless, terrorism is a word that is very laden, and that I think in considering future surveys, it might be good to try to place an additional definition on. That said, I think in the context of this survey, where we are presenting Canadians with a variety of examples of terrorism, I think and specifically of homegrown terrorism. So in the questionnaire, which is available on our website, if you go to the link at the end of my presentation here, you'll be able to see a PDF of the questionnaire that was used. There is a reference in the questionnaire both to the Parliament Hill shooting and to the Quebec City mosque shooting, and both are presented as acts of terrorism, of homegrown terrorism specifically. So to that extent, or insofar as this survey is about homegrown terrorism, that's the way that we have defined it for people. Going forward, if we were trying to draw an even greater sort of box around what is or isn't terrorism, and get people to really think above and beyond any sort of preconceived biases that they have towards thinking that this is something that is primarily, planned and executed by radical Muslim individuals, then I think that it would behoove us to provide a broader definition of terrorism as, violence committed in the name of a political ideology. That said, I think doing that also ends up limiting our ability to measure some of the biases that people have inherently when presented with terrorism conceptually. If you are defining that terrorism explicitly for people as including things by, acts committed by non-Muslim individuals, then if the respondent is already thinking about this issue or is inclined to think about this issue as something that is explicitly related to Muslims, and then you've popped that bubble for them, their responses are probably going to be different and probably going to be more alive to these other ideas, which is good from a public education standpoint, but not necessarily good in terms of capturing public opinion as it is informed by these implicit biases. So interesting considerations. Obviously, I could talk about this forever, and I have given a very long-winded answer here, and for that I apologize. But I think there's a lot of good considerations around this that I look forward to having if we do this survey again in the future.
Thank you, Ian. We have one last question, but we do have some additional time. So if people would like to get busy on the keyboard and send in some additional questions, that would be great. Okay, so Ian, in the survey, the survey indicates that 4 in 10 Canadians say that they believe there are radicalized individuals living in their community. Do we have a sense of what respondents mean when they say they, quote, believe, and what constitutes their community? I think the answer has greater meaning and significance as belief and community are more clearly defined and are better understood.
Yeah, so that is one of the major findings from this survey, and it forms part of the headline of the piece on our website, is that 4 in 10 Canadians feel that there are quote-unquote radicalized individuals living in their communities. And the way the question was specifically asked is, do you feel there are radicalized Canadians living in your community right now? And so the use of the phrase living in your community right now is, I think, meant to imply that it's a geographic community. Certainly a challenge that we have as pollsters when trying to get people to think about their communities, the area where they live, is that people live in very different places, and saying your city or town actually ends up asking people to think about something that is sort of just as nebulous as asking them to think about their community. So for instance, I live in Vancouver. I don't know if I would want to ask this question. If I were only asking Vancouverites, I might want to ask this question as, do you think there are radicalized individuals living in the city of Vancouver today? But I might also want to ask, do you think there are radicalized individuals living in your neighborhood? Obviously, not everybody lives in a major urban center. The use of the term neighborhood might not actually capture that many people. If you're talking to somebody who lives in a suburban or a rural area, that might be only, a few houses. So by asking living in your community, we are sort of leaving it up to the respondent to determine how big of a geographic net to cast. And the question, I think, is mainly aimed at getting a sense of whether Canadians have a sense of a fear or distrust of their neighbors, a sense that people who live near them might be on some seriously scary stuff. And that's, I think, it is a useful thing to measure, but it's also something that that speaks to an overabundance of such concern, perhaps, where if you ask people, do you think there are people who have radical views living in your community, you're sort of asking, do you know what everyone in your community is up to? And if you don't, how afraid are you that they might be up to something? Certainly that that may or may not, people's perceptions of that may or may not be rooted in any kind of empirical measure of the reality of their communities, but it does give a very handy look at how they are perceiving their communities and whether or not they trust the other individuals who are around them. In terms of the other, I think the other part of the question was about the definition of believe, and I think the question itself is actually phrased as feel. Do you feel there are radicalized Canadians? So again, really getting at a sort of sentimental feeling more than an empirical knowledge on the part of Canadians.
Okay, and thank you very much for that, Ian. And while you were offering that answer, another question did come in. So, in addition to whether the perpetrator is Muslim or not, radicalization also has a definitional problem in that it could refer to extremist ideas, but then very few people with extremist ideas commit acts of violence. So is it worth using the survey in the future to disambiguate between, quote, extreme ideas, quote, and, quote, violent action?
Absolutely. So the topic of the survey obviously is radicalization and homegrown terrorism. I think even the notion of becoming radicalized is not something that inherently implies violence. That may be what the question asker was saying, or maybe not. Maybe it was drawing a distinction between having extreme views and acting on those views. I think radicalization, to me, speaks to the process of becoming more extreme in one's views. And certainly not every individual who has become more extreme in their views over, a set period of time ends up committing an act of terrorism. In fact, very few such individuals actually do. Part of, I think, the usefulness of radicalization as a term and in the context of this discussion about terrorism and terrorist acts is that it conveys a degree of sort of recruitment or instigation as well, where if someone has been radicalized, there is an implied actor who has helped to radicalize them. And in this survey, we find, one of the questions that we ask about whether the Muslim community is a partner in the fight against radicalization or a part of the problem speaks to that implication as well, where there are many people in this country, an unfortunate number in my opinion, who do look at the Muslim community as a part of the problem, as the force doing the radicalizing, as opposed to as a force standing against radicalization. So in terms of whether it would be useful to further underline the difference between becoming more extreme in one's views and then becoming a homegrown terrorist, Potentially, yes, absolutely. I think it's useful to remind people, and would be useful going forward to remind people of that. At the same time, I think I wouldn't want to abandon the use of the term radicalization entirely, even though it does come with a good deal of baggage, because I think there's a real usefulness in that implication of someone who is helping to push someone down that path. And I used the Muslim community as an example, but of course radicalization is something that happens in white supremacist, or white nationalist, or Len used the term alt-right, which I think is an umbrella that certainly includes some white nationalists and white supremacists. But so looking broadly at the quote-unquote alt-right, I think radicalization is certainly something that people who are in that community, in that discourse, are actively pushing for. They're trying to recruit people to their particular ideology, and to push people who might be sympathetic to some of their aims and not to others to become more radical. And certainly not all, or even not many of those individuals will end up, if they are sort of radicalized into a harder right position, it's still highly unlikely that any of them are going to end up committing terrorist attacks. But at the same time, it's useful to think of that process as radicalization, and I guess as opposed to becoming violent.
Okay. Ian, thank you very much for this. We've reached the end of our list of questions. So Ian, I want to thank you and the Angus Reid Institute for the work you've done on this important topic, and for you for taking the time to spend with us and take us through the results. I'd also like to thank the people who participated in our audience, who offered up questions. I think they made the presentation even better. I will remind folks that this webinar has been recorded and is accessible on the Race Relations Foundation website. I also remind folks to keep an eye on our website for information about other events being put on by the Race Relations Foundation, and of course, future webinars. So until the next time, Ian, again, thank you so much. Thank you for listening, and I wish everybody a safe and very pleasant weekend.
Thank you very much, Len, and thank you everyone for participating. It's been fun.